Welcome, James. Good to see you.
Hello, Martin. Hello, everybody.
Hi, James. So, I wanted to we've had a couple of conversations in the last since you became council leader, and actually these sort of Zoom webinars that we're doing today started off right in the middle of COVID. You know, we couldn't meet in person, so we decided as a trust that it would be interesting to talk to people remotely. So Judith Blake, your predecessor, I think was the first one that we did. And so I think in part I was interested in just sort of reflecting a bit on the last 3 or 4 years, you know, coming out of COVID and then where we are today, and kind of almost looking at where we were then, what our expectations and hopes were, and then where we find ourselves today. So the first thing I wanted to sort of talk about really was this sort of post-COVID world. So when I spoke to Judith Blake, I think we were 3 months into lockdown. It was very much thinking about the short term, the impacts, the impacts this was going to have on the city. But she talked about the strengths that Leeds has in terms of the partnership working. She talked about the council's IT system and gearing that up to some remote working. We also reflected on things like, you know, how COVID would affect different communities in different ways, health inequalities being a real issue. So quite an interesting time to have a conversation. And I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you about, James, was sort of how do you think the City of Leeds has changed as a result of COVID? Sort of question one. And question two, what do you think the council has learned from those experiences that it's been able to sort of take on and incorporate into its thinking?
Okay, a nice, easy, straightforward question to start off with, Martin. I think reflecting back to 4 years ago when lockdown started, and we thought this would be a very dramatic. We knew the impact of lockdown would have on people, but we also thought it would be a very short notice, a short period. Short notice to go into. We also thought it would be a short period of disruption. I remember I had the resources portfolio on the council then, so a lot of the finance, HR, buildings, things like that on the council's executive board. And I remember some of the conversations we had around this time 4 years ago. We said, oh, well, you know, we'll be back to normal by September 2020, not realising, I think, quite how long it would last. And in that situation, I think you always get into the, had we had perfect foresight in what was going to happen, we might have done some things differently. But I think in terms of what we've learned from that, and from sat here in 2024, I think the response we had to the various challenges of COVID in terms of keeping people fed, keeping people supported, keeping people going, has sort of, and that real strength of partnership between us as a council, other public sector organisations, the private sector, charity and third sector, has fed into a lot of our best city ambition work now, where we are looking at what do we not, we're looking about what do we want to achieve as a city, and how do everybody work together towards that, rather than having a plan that was very much focused on the council itself. Now there's doing that now, there's sort of an element of we're asking people who we don't employ, we don't contract, we don't pay for, to help work towards our objectives. But I do think the strength of working we have and some of the trust and confidence in those relationships is really helpful towards that as we try and tackle some of our big challenges as a city, reducing climate change and responding to the impacts of climate change, having a healthy and well population, and looking about how we grow the economy in the city are all things that we can't do all of it as a council. So I think that's probably where we are now. And I mean, there's all sorts of things that have happened over the last 4 years. You know, we've seen, might come on to it later, you know, changes around for people that work in offices, changes around how people work, and what that means for travel and infrastructure, and things like that. But I do think now That's been something that has been, something we wanted to take as a strength of our approach during lockdown to take forward now is that response to how we all work together in the city, not necessarily not necessarily just we as a council can do everything or will only be interested in what we do as a council.
But you mentioned, the changes in working patterns. One of the things that COVID forced on us really was this idea that there were these essential workers who continued to work, providing the services that are required for society, but that those of us who sit behind a computer, work in an office, that actually there were options to work from home, options for hybrid working. We wouldn't be having this conversation online today had it not been for COVID, I suspect. So that sort of fact, the fact that many people no longer come into the office 5 days a week, 9 to 5, that they have some time where they work from home is a change that I think has endured. I don't think we necessarily knew that it would endure, but 4 years on, we're still seeing that as being very much the reality, and I know that that's the case at Leeds City Council as well. I mean, how do you think that particular aspect of the legacy of COVID, for good and for bad, what does that mean for the city, both maybe positives and negatives, for the city's economy, for people's personal welfare, those sorts of things?
I think I think about the council as a large employer in the city, and about half our staff aren't people that go to work in an office at any point. They're emptying bins, looking after people in the city and things like that. So I don't want to sort of overestimate the impact of working patterns, because like I say, there's huge numbers of people that go to work in Leeds who their patterns of work haven't changed because of COVID. I know there's been sort of changes in the economy and things like that, but the people's patterns of work haven't changed. For those people who have, I still a debate about, people working from home all of the time, some of the time, none of the time, and the options around that. I think that overall, in Leeds, we can see from footfall patterns and travel patterns that Mondays and Fridays, Mondays in particular, are quiet for travel. Midweek is about where it was before COVID. I mean, things vary over time, and the weekends in particularly in Leeds city centre are sometimes busier than they were before COVID. So there has been some changes in that. How it is a little bit of the question around would some of these changes have happened slower or quicker without COVID, but they would have happened anyway. Again, I come back to the council as an employer. We were encouraging, as part of our work on our buildings before COVID, we were encouraging people not to work 5 days a week in the office. So, it has accelerated that, but that was a change we were looking at, people taking days working from home. Some people feel it's better for them not to come to work from home some days a week if they can. I think some people also feel a bit of the career development opportunities might be missing if people are sat at home focused on their own work and not around colleagues. So it's a huge debate, and not one I feel qualified to say I've come up with the answer to. But we do recognise the change. You can see it in terms of like I say, travel and infrastructure use in Leeds, but it doesn't mean people aren't travelling. People are travelling differently. You can see it in again, like I say, some of the economy in Leeds city centre. There's been changes in retail, changes in food and drink offer, more residential, more buildings being used as residential. I think of the House of Fraser building on Briggate, just as an example. Yeah. Again, I think some of those changes would have happened, and maybe COVID accelerated that. Looking to the future, it's clear it's clear with some of the developments happening, like Wellington Place completing and other, I think of Globe Point on Water Lane, where actually new office developments in the city centre are coming forward. Obviously, a big part of the Vastant development on the old Tetley site is office, not residential. So clearly, people who are developing sites and bringing in investment to the city can see there is still a future for people coming to work in offices. So it is it is something I think that obviously we will continue to sort of recognise that there's still a good number of people will commute into Leeds. So again, it is part of. It's still going to be part of what happens in the future. And like I say, I think the city centre will be different, but still, it'll still have a strong retail offer. It might not be the retail offer of the early 1990s when I worked on a shopping brigade before it had the White Rose Centre or Amazon, but it'll still be there. There'll still be a really strong food and drink offering. Leeds City Centre. I think the transport connections, the institutions that are in the city centre that bring people in will still be a big part of it, even though it will be, even though there will be some changes.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you look at you mentioned Wellington Place, you mentioned Globe Point, you know, high quality office developments, really high quality office developments. You know, I think the trend is for particularly the larger businesses where they can afford this to upgrade, you know, to upgrade their facilities. I guess partly because, you know, if you've got people working from home a couple of days a week, you can afford to spend a bit more on a smaller space, but actually have a higher spec space to encourage people to come in at least for, you know, 2-3 days of the week. So I think Arup have got their opening event at Wellington Place this week. They've moved out of a place where they've been for many years into a state-of-the-art, you know, building on Wellington Place. So I think there's been a bit of that. What do you think it means for our sort of district centres, for the outlying areas? Because if people are spending more time, you know, in front of their laptops at home, then that would suggest that we need to think a bit more about, you know, the places where people live rather than thinking about, you know, the city centre locations. Do you think we need to look a bit more at how those areas are improved and made more vibrant, you know, the district centres?
Yeah, I think again the change in economy where people are when they work is going to have an impact on some on some areas. We used to talk about 50-minute neighbourhoods, but that sort of became a bit of a conspiracy theory on some corners of the internet, but trying to sort of work in a way where we're supporting the development of people having everything they need within walking distance, and not having to drive in as many places in the city as possible. I think that's still a valid idea, even if, like I say, it's been in some places it's been suggested that it's a further attempt at whatever secret agenda people think we're applying to this. But it is an important part of it. I think one of the things that has really grown from COVID onwards is online shopping and delivery networks. That is something that supports. It might not necessarily change district centres, but it supports people who are at home rather than going to buy things in a shop. Things come to you, and that's we've seen sort of significant development of facilities to support that section, that part of the economy. And district centres again, and where you know businesses have a good offer. They're going to do really well in district centres.
Could I talk a little bit then about the city centre and the changes that we've seen again over the last 3-4 years? So again, looking back to the conversations I had with Judith immediately after the COVID emergency was announced, there was some fairly short-term government-funded schemes to facilitate social distancing. Some of the cycle lanes were segregated. So there was a bit of that happening in those early days. And I actually, you know, said at the time, you know, is this an opportunity almost to accelerate some of these the council's proposed changes to the transport network in Leeds, take advantage of the fact that the roads are quiet to actually push forward on some of the things like the closure of City Square, for example, which obviously depended on other road network issues being resolved. So I think it was an interesting conversation. Of course, what people perhaps didn't appreciate, council certainly appreciated, but maybe the population at large didn't appreciate this was the significant program of transport works that was about to happen. So they happened during the COVID period and are still happening to this day. Lots of interventions. City Square has now been closed through traffic. Other highway schemes, cycle network being extended, etc. I guess those changes come at a cost in the short term, which is the upheaval that they cause. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that, because I think there is a sense in which, is it worth the upheaval? Is it worth the sort of issues that are caused short term by roads being closed and traffic being diverted and all the rest of it? Is it actually worth it?
So I'm trying to think where to start my history lesson on this, Martin. Like I said, I said a bit earlier, I used to work in a shop on Briggate when Briggate were 3 lanes of main traffic coming through the city centre. And I imagine at the point where Briggate was closed and traffic was moved and probably the loop, which no longer there, was introduced, probably similar discussions were had, but nobody's coming back to say, what Leeds really needs is one of the main arteries from the motorways to North Leeds and Harrogate to be, and places like that, to be right up the middle of Briggate. So we have seen it is not unprecedented for changes to happen in Leeds. I think part of it is, the road system that was put in the mid-90s was always going to become really congested. There were times, and again, it is before lockdown, it sort of feels like that sort of become a measurement of time. Where actually Leeds city centre was really congested. We didn't have the system was struggling before to get traffic round the city centre. A lot of development in the south of the railway line, south of the river in the city centre was putting more pressure on it. And that's why a lot of investment had to be put into having a growing city, but also one that had the infrastructure in place to support that. I think not everything the council has done has been about stopping people driving. A lot of the work around Armley Gyratory, for example, is to increase the capacity around Armley Gyratory as a junction, and other works happen to do that, to look about how we can have a functioning traffic system. Some of the work that's been done by National Highways on the motorway, on the M621, is also about that as well, about how people can get in and out of Leeds with less congestion. Obviously work further out from the city centre, work for the East Leeds Orbital Road as well, was around putting in infrastructure to support investment and trying to support investment and housing growth, and trying to prevent that causing a huge amount of congestion. So it is not, it is a series of work. You're right in your question, Martin, as well. Quite a lot of what has happened in the last 4 or 5 years was planned before COVID, and we had the money that the government gave us when the trolleybus scheme didn't go ahead towards public transport investment, and a lot of that was planned for the city centre around how the buses move better around the city centre, recognising it was often a source of congestion where you had buses and traffic in together. My bus route home to Kippocks was one that went up Ball Lane and Duncan Street, and that route through town. And at times, the hour-long journey home, 15 minutes could be spent between City Square and getting past where the bus station and the Playhouse is, that side of Leeds. So it has made a difference on that. I know it's been disrupted. There's things that always happen. There's been days when a combination of works have been planned by the council and things like water mains bursting, electricity cables needing fixing in a very emergency situation have caused a lot of congestion. Fortunately, not too often, but I know there were days when there was a lot of congestion, and like I say, not every piece of work that happens on infrastructure is planned, but that's the nature of what it is. But I think it is, like you say, in terms of improving public transport and then supporting the growth of the city in terms of commercial and residential development, it was what was needed to make sure that what we always used to talk about being the largest brownfield site in Europe is now starting to be really developed out, and we needed the infrastructure in place to deal with that.
But maybe, do you think that has always been that sort of overarching picture has been communicated as well as it could have been? Because my sense is that, you know, there are reasons why certain things come on stream at a certain point in time, and it's often funding related. You wouldn't necessarily do it in the order that it ends up being done, but it's because the money comes from government to do this, and then some money comes from somewhere else to do that. But I guess, do you think the overall picture, you know, the finished product, the sort of we see the piece of the jigsaw, do we see the picture?
I hope so. I think, I mean, we've talked 4 years since COVID started, and I don't want to keep talking about COVID, but I do think in terms of timing, the fact that some schemes were happening just as COVID started, some schemes came on during lockdown, and particularly at that time, and people quite rightly focused on other things, or people were, you know, people, I know chatting to people in my own area, people sometimes didn't come into the city centre for 2 or 3 years, and saw a lot of changes. But like I say, I think hopefully people will, now that the focus is away from a lot of the structural steelworks going on, people will see the wider picture around what is happening. Like I say, particularly as now it is still, you know, it's still a lot of development and change happening in the city centre.
The just talking about public transport, I mean, again, you think about where we were 4 years ago. I'm not sure that anyone would have, you know, writing a list of where we would stand now in relation to public transport. Would we be saying that bus franchising has now been given the green light by the combined authority, and is very likely to happen in 3 or 4 years' time? Would we be saying that mass transit there's a degree of confidence that we will finally get a mass transit system in West Yorkshire? But on the other hand, maybe we wouldn't be saying that HS2 is no longer happening. So the sort of public transport picture has certainly moved on a lot in the last 4 years, but maybe not necessarily quite in the way that people would have imagined. What are your sort of general thoughts about where we stand in relation to public transport?
One of the reasons we were really keen to have a Metro Mayor for West Yorkshire was to make these steps forward in the bits that we can control locally. We wouldn't have been able to do bus franchising without a Metro Mayor, and it was in the combined authority meeting last week, it was Tracy's own decision to go for bus franchising. That wouldn't have happened if we did not had a Metro Mayor. I know there's lots of debates going back 5 or 6 years around what the geography of a Metro Mayor would be. But I think we moved on from talking about the process of devolution to actually what it can do. And bus franchising is a very clear example of that, and being able to start talking about the bus network we want and how we deliver that. Mass transit is an interesting one because, again, it was something that was. I think I was still at primary school when mass transit was being talked about, which was the route that went out at Skyline roundabout on Selby Road in East Leeds, and I can't remember the rest of the route. But that was, I think we've got a very clear and compelling case around the tram now, which isn't based on everyone else has got one and we haven't got one. I don't think that's the best argument to make for asking for a lot of money from central government. It's not based around here's a 23 bus and we're going to turn it, the 23 bus route into a tram route. It's based around linking up West Yorkshire, around the wider point about how do we get the right infrastructure in to support housing development, commercial property development in Leeds, Bradford, Cllr Lewis. That's a really important argument. It's very clear from London that to deliver more intensive housing growth, and by intensive I mean in terms of more houses and flats for less land, you need that really strong public transport. You can't have it dominated by roads for cars and parking for cars. So it is a way of supporting that, and I think those arguments, rather than some of the perhaps schemes of the past will really demonstrate the case for the tram element of mass transit. And obviously we'll get the bus, an integrated franchise bus network, and the hopeful improvements on the on the existing railways as well. You know, it's sometimes I'm trying to give a very firm future look. You look back at just, we rely on it. So if I get the train from my local stations in Micklefield or Garforth, I'm getting on a railway line in the stations built in 1832, and it's still very intensively used today, but it's fundamentally a network that we've had for a very long time. I think the railway viaduct across the middle of Leeds city centre was built in the 1860s. It's all, again, very intensively and key to what we're doing today, but we're using very old infrastructure, not actually looking about what infrastructure do we need for what we want to do today, not what infrastructure have we got and how do we alter and amend that. And that's an important part of it. And again, the tram element of mass transit is linking up things like the two hospitals, Leeds and Bradford city centres, sites for development in between. Elland Road football ground, which for me is a very important location in Leeds, and it is doing it in a way that fundamentally the existing rail infrastructure or existing bus services won't be able to do. And I think that's the really important part of it. And again, looking at you know, we'll come on to much more detail, fine details of routes later this year. But again, a lot of the redevelopment that's happening around inner South Leeds, regeneration Holbeck, one of our successful levelling up bids, and the opportunities at the for job growth at things like some of the sites around Elland Road at the White Rose Office Park, not necessarily the shopping centre, but the office park and things like that. So huge opportunities that mass transit will be a key part of us delivering, rather than saying, oh, well, Nottingham's got one and Manchester's got one, so we have to have one.
What about HS2? Because I mean, that's the one thing that hasn't happened and doesn't look like happening, that maybe four years ago was still kind of, I can't remember when the announcement was made actually not to go up to Leeds, but you know, it was still looking like a possibility. That isn't happening. I think we're presumably planning on the basis that it won't happen now. Still, the land is still reserved, of course, and I think some of it needs to stay reserved for other reasons. What are your thoughts about HS2 as a sort of a, you know, as a lesson in how not to deliver a large rail infrastructure project, because it has been chaotic, hasn't it?
And for us, the chaos is still going to continue because Leeds Station is up to capacity. There is still a commitment to Northern Powerhouse Rail, the east-west rail improvements. However, they will be delivered with really important for our neighbours in Bradford, getting a through city centre station with much faster connections in and out of Bradford. But to do that, some of the elements that were in the HS2 scheme will still be needed in Leeds. So there's no way of majorly expanding Leeds Station without using elements of the T-shaped HS2 station, for example. There's no, if you want to have more trains east and west through Leeds Station, some of the trains that are going south or north have to go somewhere else, and the T-shaped station is elements of that are going to be crucial. Otherwise, it's very difficult to see without having to have trade-offs about reducing services that are currently running to get new services in around the station. So some of the HS2 routes around, looking about how you can get more capacity sort of immediately to the south and immediately to east of Leeds. Those are big questions that everybody involved in transport have known have been around for a long time. And HS2, in a very local sense, I know sometimes got a bit carried away with it's all that money for 20 minutes off a journey to London, but actually some of the elements of that scheme were really important for some of our local and regional challenges that need addressing in Leeds. We're going to have to find ways of doing that with the railways. Otherwise,
does that also, I mean, someone's put a question down about sort of the interchange aspect of all of this. We've got the tram system hopefully coming on stream in the next 5-10 years. We've got you know, the bus franchising coming, improved local rail services, you know, the opportunities with an expanded station. Is that all part of that picture as well? The sort of the interchange part, jumping on one mode of transport, getting onto another?
Yes, yeah, it is about how it is around how people. So heavy rail for Leeds is I mean, there's some parts of Leeds have a good suburban service. Actually, for a lot of travel within Leeds, rail isn't part of the picture. It's going to be bus and mass transit, but it is an important gateway to people coming in and out of Leeds from around the region and around the country, and getting that interchange right, and how that those onward journeys from rail travel are dealt with is going to be an important part of how we look at planning what happens next. And like I say, some of the elements around, if the railway station is going to be even busier, how do you get those connections to other journeys, into there? Mass transit will be part of the answer, but it's not going to be the whole answer.
James, have you got another 5 minutes or so? Are you okay to carry on?
Yes, yeah.
Just a couple more areas to cover it from my sort of point of view. Maybe we could just move on to, and I'll come back to a question around just looking at the environment and some issues around the environment. But I wanted to touch on, you've mentioned that one of the changes in the last 4 years was that we became part of a mayoral authority. Tracy Brabin was elected 4 years ago, 3-4 years ago. So that's a change. And then we had these announcements, didn't we, in the last couple of weeks in the budget, which I think were trailed at a conference in Leeds a couple of weeks earlier, around a new partnership being formed with the Leeds City Council, West Yorkshire Combined Authority, and national government, looking at the housing development, increasing housing numbers around the rim of the city. I thought that was quite interesting because, we have had different variations of this in the past in Leeds. We had the Leeds Development Corporation that was effectively took over planning in certain parts of the city centre, the waterfront, Kirkstall Valley, and added some government money in, assembled land. You might not, people have got different views about the mechanisms that were used, but it was certainly a regeneration, it certainly performed a regenerating function. But now we've had this announcement, this new partnership. Could you say a bit about that and why that's happened now, do you think? Why? Because I know that other places have had these slightly more formal partnerships with government that we haven't had that in Leeds. So why is that sort of happening now, do you think? And can you just say a bit about how it will work?
Yeah, so I mean, I spent most of the 80s at primary school, so I'm not the person to talk about how what happened then. But in terms of the regeneration partnership, it is around schemes and plans that we've been working on for a while, bringing them together and looking about how we can focus on that delivery. It's not about ripping up and starting again years of work around things. So, for example, around the South Bank, around the innovation arc between the universities, the hospitals and the station, around some of the work we've been doing on things like projects like the British Library North and a newer programme, the National Poetry Centre. So it's not around a brand new list of things. It's around looking about what have we got, what have we worked with stakeholders, what have we consulted the public on. Elements in Holbeck come through a neighbourhood plan, which was worked on by the community and voted for in a referendum. So it brings together our existing work, looks about actually how can we, as the three organisations, national government, combined authority and us, focus our resources on getting that delivered. So that's what it's about. It's not a new structure. It's not a new or substitute for any of our existing planning policies, whether it's the citywide ones or some of the local ones that we've consulted on. It's a way of looking about how can we get the government and resources focused on delivering what we've all recognised needs doing in Leeds.
That's really helpful. And we were pleased to see that this was happening from a trust point of view. As you probably know, we've done some work around the east side of Leeds. We've developed a vision for that part of the city centre, the area where you have a domination of highway land. And actually, as you were saying earlier on, if we're going to build more densely, but also provide green space, provide pleasant routes for pedestrians and cyclists, something has to give, and actually part of that is better public transport, which then enables you to reduce car dependency and reduce the road space that you're taking up, etc., etc. So I think that side of things is really important, and then that does enable you to get the densities up in terms of the houses. So we'll sort of keep an eye on that, and a really interesting development, I think. Which brings me on, I suppose, to just a broader question. Well, yeah, but maybe just very quickly, a slightly broader question about this relationship between Leeds, Wyker, and central government, and how that dynamic works and will work and should work. What are you finding in terms of particularly the Wyker link, because that's been bedded down for a little while now? How does the council work with the West Yorkshire Combined Authority?
So, as council leader, I'm a member of the Combined Authority, so I think I work very well with myself.
Yes.
I mean, we were really keen to get a Metro Mayor and talked about we needed that to unlock bus franchising and to have that work, to have that focus on particularly transport infrastructure and development like that. So it is, and sort of over recent years, government funding streams like the City Region Sustainable Transport Pot and bus service improvement plan and things like that have come through the Combined Authority. It's where government has chosen to fund projects like that. So it is a really important thing. It's also that recognition that, particularly on things like developing transport projects, actually, West Yorkshire is a really important functional economic area, and we need to look about how we do things. My council ward borders Wakefield, for example. I know lots of people I represent as a councillor work in the Wakefield district. People don't live their lives by council boundaries drawn up in 1972 or whenever. So it is that West Yorkshire wide aspect is really important. So I think it has been I mean, Wicker's been in place now as long as West Midlands Combined Authority and others, and I think it is a really good working relationship. So, like I say, getting that those projects delivered and that for things like economic and some of the transport networks, a proper West Yorkshire wide view about how we do stuff, and having that authority and role to do so.
I mean, I guess that brings me on to the sort of final area I wanted to cover, which was council funding, local authority funding, the combined authority relationship and how it's sort of how it's developed over the last 4 years. I mean, there is obviously by national government a sense in which the combined authorities receive funding that perhaps wouldn't end up being filtered down to the local authority. So there's a funding advantage there, I suspect. But I mean, more generally, we were talking before we started the interview about the pressures the council has in terms of its finances. I was interested actually at an event 3 or 4 months ago that Tom Reardon spoke at, the council's chief executive, where he did actually make it clear that Leeds City Council isn't in the sort of position that other local authorities are in, where there's the sort of existential threat, if you like, to some of these local authorities in terms of the finances. Leeds isn't in that position. Nonetheless, Leeds is in a really dire position in terms of reducing funding over the last 10-15 years. So 2 questions really, James. One relates to something that happened during COVID, and then one is a more general question about council funding. So during COVID, the council was due to introduce a clean air zone, and this was backed by government funding. Cameras were installed. It would have raised a degree of funding, which I think we're now seeing is happening in Bradford, who've done a similar thing. That was cancelled, I think, because the pollution levels came below the level at which the intervention was required. And also, some of the requirements in terms of more environmentally efficient vehicles that came to pass as well. So I think we understand why that happened. But from a funding point of view, it did close off an option for the council in terms of raising revenue. So I guess the question I'm asking you is something like a clean air zone. If the trams, you know, come on stream, if we have bus franchising, a better bus network, is this something the council is going to have to actually seriously look at again? And then other ways of raising revenue as well, because you know the situation, whoever is in charge in Westminster in the next 12 months isn't going to improve radically. You know, the pressures will still be there. So question one is fundraising, revenue raising from other places. How, to what extent is the council prepared to actually go down those routes? And more generally, what are your views on local government funding and how it should be changed? Because the current system doesn't work, does it?
Okay, 3 questions there. I'll try and rattle through
Okay.
them. So in terms of the charging clean air zone, we were one of the first councils to recognise we needed to do it and do all the work around with the government around getting grants and loans out to commercial vehicle operators to improve the emissions from vehicles, and then mostly local buses, HGVs, taxi private hire. We got to the position before lockdown. This is a really important point.
Yeah.
The emissions levels across Leeds were below the level that you could legally introduce a charging zone before lockdown came in. So using data from 2019, we would have been in a position where selective vehicle charging, which was the clean air zone, would have been those vehicles in vehicle classes that had the older and polluting engines. In a way, you want the revenue from that to reduce over time, because you're not. It was never. It was about reducing emissions by reducing vehicles that had particularly high levels of emissions. So therefore, you wanted that revenue to be lower because the outcome you wanted was less older and polluting vehicles and cleaner air. We'd have been in a position had we brought it in, where actually we wouldn't have raised that much money, because most of the work had been done on cleaning up those on cleaning up those vehicles. Our plan was you could only use the money you raise. This is in the national legislation. You can only use the money you raise on further clean air initiatives. It wasn't something that could have supported the council coffers overall. But like I say, we were in the position we got to where on the legal framework, we did have the, like I say, we did meet the legal levels. There's a wider debate about whether air pollution levels set in 2005, I think it was, are the right ones to apply today. We always want to do more. But in terms of that specific programme, we had been successful in, like I say, reducing particulate pollution, which was the objective, and we wouldn't have, we'd have probably been, potentially raising very little money from it. The second one on new revenue charges, we do look at that as a council. We have introduced car parking charges at some district centres and parks as part of bringing in extra money. I know from my email inbox, people have very strong views about that, but those are the sort of the options that we would look at. I think there's some interesting things around infrastructure. So the East Leeds Orbital Road was effectively using supplementary planning policy to have a roof tax on development on that. So people that know the East Leeds area, the area between the new road and the existing Leeds settlement, not the villages on the outside, but the existing Leeds settlement on the east and inside, will be developed for housing over time, and each of those new houses will pay a small contribution to the road. So that's not
that sort of thing could apply, for example, to this new.
Yeah. So there are options around funding infrastructure. That's not. So the East Leeds Orbital Road, I think the pace that we were able to develop it at, because we didn't need Treasury approval for everything we were doing, meant that we could do it quicker. We had our own, had our own funding sources alongside some other transport funding to make that happen. So there are options for revenue that's not government grant or local taxation for services. Like I say, some of it could be around how we fund infrastructure. Other things, like I say, we are doing it. Don't go down very well with people, but it's part of having to balance a budget. I mean, the third part of it moving forward is it was in the news today just around what a huge share of council spending is going on supporting the most vulnerable children and adults that we provide social care for. And I think fundamentally, if there's going to be a long-term answer to council funding, it's going to be how that's apportioned against the sort of the local environmental placemaking, protective services that the council provides. A lot of things like libraries, culture, museums and galleries. It's all been squeezed into a much smaller portion of council's overall budget, and I think fundamentally any long-term answer is going to come on that relationship.
Just picking up on a very quick on a couple of the Q&As before we finish, James. Yeah, we've dealt with the interchange issue. Just going back to the buses, yes. Would night buses become a possibility? I guess the answer is yes, they would under franchising because the WICA would be commissioning the services. So that's something we don't have really at the moment.
Yes, yeah. Having made the decision to move on to franchising last week, that's the kind of work that needs looking at around how contracts are let and the routes and times that they run. So there'll be a lot of, I know there'll be a lot of interest in how the bus network is developed in both terms of routes. It's always a concern around, I know it's always a concern around some of the hospitality businesses in the city centre, not necessarily night buses, that how quickly services either end in an evening, so some routes end at 8, 9, or how sort of frequencies drop from maybe 4 or 6 buses an hour down to 1 or 2 buses an hour at 7 or 8 in the evening. So there's lots of work to be done around what the network will look like.
A final one then on the Q&As is Thwaite. It's a very specific one, Thwaite Mill, which I know the council. I think the announcement has now been made that will close in a couple of weeks' time. Not council-owned building, leased to the council from the Canals and Rivers Trust. We've got a question here from Clive, asking if it can be kept open to the autumn. Can volunteers run it? Can you sort of just deal with that sort of general issue of maybe talk about Thwaites, but also the general issue around asset disposal?
We're in a position, and it comes back to the question about council finances. The position that Birmingham and Nottingham are in, for example, with commissioners coming in and making decisions about finances, where when we set the council's budget for a year, we're well beyond the point of where we sit down and think, what would it be nice to do? We were to the point of we have a legal responsibility as a council to set a balanced budget. And with the pressures of inflation that we've had and the reductions in government grant that we've had, that means that things that the council's done for a long time just fundamentally can't happen anymore. And it is down to that point now where those decisions are being made to balance the council budget, not around what would we like to do in the city. And I think that point's worth making, just to sort of spell out how difficult the Leeds Council's financial position is, and that's why some of the wider decisions, the building, it's not our, unlike the rest of the museums and galleries estate, if I can put it that way, in Leeds. Thwaite Mill wasn't owned by the council; it was owned by the Canal and River Trust, and we passed it back to them and it's up to them how they determine what its future use is.
Okay. Final thing, James. Then that's been really interesting. Thanks for that. If we have a chat in a couple of years' time, what question do you think I should be asking you in 2 years hence?
I think in 2 years' time, I hope we won't still be talking about the council's budget problems, but we may well be. I think we'll be looking about we'll be into a lot of the fine detail of development of mass transit. You may well be asking me about how that's going. In 2026, we'll be coming to the point where we'll be starting to see buses being franchised, so you might be asking me about that. I am sure there will be, I mentioned the Poetry Centre in the British Library North as projects that we're working on at the moment. I'm sure there will be, as we look around the development of the city, there'll be new projects coming along that you will be asking me about. Probably we'll be looking then at the council's development plan up to 2040, so you may well be asking me around, we've talked a bit around development around Holbeck and the South Bank. It'll be the what comes next in terms of areas of development, so those would be my guesses.
And in 2026, 2 years' time, it'll be the 400th anniversary of Leeds becoming a place, receiving its charter. So I think this is something that certainly Leeds Civic Trust are going to have a think about in terms of how we mark that important milestone. So that may well be something else that we talk about at the time as well. Great, James. That's been really, really interesting. As I say, we've recorded this so people can watch it at their leisure. And just to say, we've got one more of these talking heads coming up, and that will be on March the 25th with Cllr from Leeds 2023. So a bit of a look back on the Leeds Year of Culture last year, which I think will be really interesting because again we talked to her before the year of cultural events actually kicked off. So looking back a bit on how that all worked will be, I think, be a really interesting chat. So appreciate your time, James. I hope you have a good
Thank
day.
you.
And thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you.